see here. I just want to make sure you can see that. Can you see that? Okay. Great. This is going to be a really fast journey. We're going to see kids all the way from being happy with little cats, as you're seeing here, to kids under very, very difficult situations. And throughout this talk, what I want you to notice is, what is the role of kids for these photographers? Are they actually interested in the kids themselves? As in some cases, we'll see it's their actual children. In other cases, you could argue that the kids are almost a prop, whether a prop for social reform or a prop for maybe artistic purposes. So let's go ahead and get started. And not surprisingly, I'm going to start you off with Victorian times, and there's Queen Victoria looking very regal. And I'm considering this period a period from about the mid-19th century to the beginnings of the 20th. We'll talk a little bit about pictorialism. You may remember that term from the lecture we did on women photographers. And again, you may remember this name from 2 weeks ago, Julia Margaret Cameron. She picked up her first camera at the age of 48, an upper society woman. This is a time when photography was available mostly to the wealthy. This was not photography for a career or for money. And she would have people like these young little girls pose for her and create these lovely tableaus. It could be like the kids of a friend, it could be neighbors, it could be people in her circles. And you may remember that we talked about the soft focus she uses. This is children representing innocence, piety. She was actually quite religious. There's the soft focus that she used in her camera work was actually criticized by some of the experts. They thought there's nothing crisp and technically great about this. But that's the whole point, is that she creates these tableaus of two girls. These are actually sisters holding red and white roses. And I don't know if you know, but at least then roses represented youthful and innocent beauty. So you've got, this is a perfect example of what photography was about. It was about beauty. Let me read you a quote from Julia Margaret Cameron. She felt that she wanted to enable photography and secure for it the character and uses of high art. So it was her way of saying, if we're going to take photographs, we're going to make them really, really precious. And speaking of her being a bit religious, you know, here's literally a child representing the angel of the nativity. So there's props, again, there's this soft focus, and there's this kind of elevating photography to something really holy and really wonderful. Now, someone else I wanted to cover today, you may recognize the name more by the pseudonym that he used for Alice in Wonderland. You know, Lewis Carroll was actually not only an Oxford mathematician, he taught math at Oxford, he was also eventually obviously a poet and an author. And he actually became very friendly with some young girls in his inner circles. By the way, this has been controversial over the years, although there's never been anything established that there was anything inappropriate happening here. By today's standard, it probably was a little bit strange that this man is hanging with what he called ideal child friends. In this case, Alice Liddell was one of his sitters, and he has her posing as the beggar maid, which is from a Lord Tennyson poem. So again, you've got props, you've got a costume, you've got kind of a tableau, and he's made sure that she's standing there with kind of like this tattered little dress. It's a little bit touchy, a little bit controversial. Again, people have come forward and said there was absolutely nothing inappropriate about these relationships. Now, this is not that different if you think about Julia Margaret Cameron, but it is different is now it's a guy. So, and here's another one of the sitters that Lewis Carroll had. It looks like CA, it's actually Exie. It was a nickname for Alexandra, Exie Kitchen. And again, you see the use of props. She's standing there as a Chinese tea merchant. So there was a lot of fantasy and creating an image that would almost compete with painting. Now, I thought you would be interested in knowing that, of course, portraiture of kids was very common. And I don't know how many of you know what a carte de visite is, but these were very popular, small little pictures that became very popular in the 1860s. Their inventor was this French man, Desideri, and these became basically little visiting cards. So if my mother, Mrs. Olivares, arrived to visit a friend of hers, she would provide this little card with her photograph. It was almost like your official calling card. And these became a craze, especially when they started featuring famous people on them. When Emperor Napoleon III was featured, they almost became what's been described as cardomania. People wanted to trade them and get a hold of them. So again, here you see these beautiful kids just in a portrait situation as part of one of these cards. If we move across the Atlantic to New York, photographers like Alfred Stieglitz became proponents of what was called pictorialism. And they established actually a group called the Photo Secession. I want you to remember that in 1880, Kodak had issued cameras that average people could go around and use. So some of these artists wanted to elevate photography, not just to a snapshot of a neighbor or a friend. If you look at this, this is a beautifully composed photograph with these girls in beautiful costumes, you know, in this wonderful moment, dropping off a letter in the letterbox. So it was all about elevating photography again to an art that could compete with painting. And one of his friends, and also a member of the Photo Secessionist group, was Gertrude Cassivier. And here she's portraying the Clarence White family, and Clarence White was yet another photographer of the Photo Secession. And imagine a photograph that's, I mean, you can't talk about anything more idealized, right? It's like the boys are in their little sailor suits, the light is coming beautifully through the window, and there's Mr. Clarence White and wife and the three boys. And this is all what you could expect from picture. It was very idealized, it was very elevated, it was very beautiful, very staged and very artificial. So now we're gonna go to the extreme opposite. I wanted to show you that just to say that for a long time, photography was about the upper crust, the beauty, raising photography for elegance sake. And then at the same time, you had the beginnings of what would be called the muckrakers. So we're gonna look at some of the photographers that were taking photos for social reform. I've included a picture here of a magazine. This is, believe it or not, from 1901. McClure's magazine was one of the magazines focused on progressive ideas for the lower classes, the immigrants, the tenements, and so on. And here's this great quote from President Teddy Roosevelt, kind of acknowledging that the men with the muckrakes are often indispensable to the well-being of society, but only if they know when to stop raking the muck. And by the way, muckraking is a reference to Pilgrim's Progress. But the idea is that these were the people that were actually questioning and doing journalism and finding dirt and corruption in an early 20th century that was full of issues that the progressives needed to address. So let's start with Jacob Riis. And what's funny is if you think about it, this period he's working in is not that different from Julia Margaret Cameron. It's just that he's seeing the world from an entirely different perspective. Some of you may know that and by the way, it's funny, I was looking at potentially going to the beach in the Rockaways this weekend, and there's a park and beach there called the Jacob Riis Park. So he took photographs and he created a book that was a watershed book called How the Other Half Lives. So imagine, it was almost like showing to the upper classes and the middle classes, while you're enjoying life and kind of hanging out, there's an entirely other reality right here in New York. If you look at the census and the reality, this is absolutely unbelievable, but you know that the Lower East Side of New York was the most populated place in the entire United States. And he basically started going in and taking photographs of the situation of the tenements in the Lower East Side. And here's a great example. Something I want you to know that's fascinating is he's actually considered one of the fathers of flash photography. When we were looking at Julia Margaret Cameron and company, there was no flash photography. He was instrumental in coming up with these magnesium combinations. He actually would use his frying pan, and he figured out how to create flash photography. And the reason that's so important is, imagine going into a dark tenement. You never would have had the enough natural light to be picturing this. This one is sweet, but also sad. It's a reminder that, you know, back then, little children took care of little children. I mean, the parents were probably super busy working. And so this scene is reminiscent of, you know, this is what went on. I want you to notice that his style was all about the journalism and the image. The cropping's terrible, the composition isn't great. Here's like a piece of a woman. So this is not considered like high-end photography, but it was photography with a purpose. Here's a boy, can you believe it? A boy 12 years old, pulling thread in a sweatshop. And I find it shocking that these men are like, yeah, so what? Children work here, what do you want from us? I learned that some of the streets of New York were so crowded with horses and carriages, they were actually very dangerous. So this scene in an alley of boys shooting craps was typical of what you would see, because kids actually, if they wanted to play, tended to play in the alleys. And this one, which is just really kind of touching and sad, it looks like something out of Oliver Twist. It's children sleeping in Mulberry Street. By the way, I thought you would find it interesting that the reason Jacob Riis originally wound up in Mulberry Street was the New York Tribune. He was assigned to the police office down in Mulberry Street, and Mulberry Street was called then Death's Thoroughfare. That's how dangerous that area of Manhattan was considered. So moving quickly to Lewis Hines, because we're still in this vein of social reform, Lewis Hines is known for being the most important photographer that went out and documented child labor at the turn of the century. Do you know that in the 1900 census, and we all hopefully have filled out our census for 2020 now, 1 out of every 6 children in the US were actually gainfully employed. That means that not only were they working, they weren't going to school. Now, Lewis Hines, my mom will be excited to hear this, was a sociologist, and he wound up becoming part of what was called the National Child Labor Committee. And they were committed to addressing this issue of child labor at the turn of the century. Mind you, the jobs he did, this job that he went out and did was very dangerous, because, you know, these kids were hired almost like, it was like a hidden, not a good thing if you had kids. It was like, who are you and why do you want to come in here? So what's fascinating is that Hines would say that he's a factory machine mechanic or he's a fire inspector. So he couldn't say, I'm here to be a journalist and show kids working. And this is outrageous because you see this huge man basically supervising these children in Mississippi. Check this out. It's like they're barefoot on these really dangerous machines in Macon, Georgia. Now I want you to notice, remember how I said Jacob Riis was not particularly interested in composition and color and lighting. Lewis Hines was. He was using what's called a narrow point of focus or shallow depth of field. If you look, the child is in great focus and then he blurs the background. So he was much more adept of how do I bring attention to my subject? And the end, the subject is this young cotton mill worker. I mean, these are absolutely beautiful, beautiful images, if troubling. This one's really sad. You know that Lewis Hines actually spoke to these kids. He would ask them their name, how many hours they work, how much they make. This little boy lost his fingers in a cotton mill machine. And it just shows you that these were not only horrendous jobs, but also very dangerous. Even though we love the musical Newsies and they were tap dancing and having fun, those jobs of children that went out and delivered newspapers were not nice jobs. They were up half the night preparing for their shifts. This one I think is fascinating because you've got the kids here and then you've got this man that almost looks like this greedy man just standing there like, yeah, I've got these kids delivering the paper. I mean, there's just something kind of horrendous about that. And mind you, these were called breaker kids. And this is absolutely shocking. These are minors. These are, well, they're minors and they're minors. They're minors. They're minors that are children in the mines of Pennsylvania, going in hours and hours on end, separating ore by hand. So can you imagine, and I just want to say that Lewis Hines is recognized for having been instrumental in showing the world, and especially, of course, the US government, what was happening, and in passing state by state child labor laws. Walker Evans, many of you know this name. He's one of the biggest photographers of the 20th century in the US. Originally, he was known for his work, along with Dorothea Lange and others, going out and documenting the people in the Dust Bowl and the Depression. But I don't know if you knew this, but at one point, Fortune magazine commissioned Walker Evans to work with James Agee to work on a book called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And this book involved going and visiting 3 families of sharecroppers, specifically in Alabama. And so this, in many ways, is still in keeping with this idea of photography for social reform. And I don't have to tell you, but the conditions of these families in Hale County, Alabama were absolutely terrible. I mean, imagine this little boy, it's like he's literally half, I mean, talk about being half naked. This photograph is beautiful and sad too. The way this little child is holding on to the bed almost looks like he's jailed, right? Like he cannot escape this terrible reality, again, in Hale County, Alabama. And 1936, as you know, was probably the worst year of the Depression. I thought I would include this photo. I like it because it shows one of the families singing religious hymns. And it almost makes you think that that's literally, at some point, religion was the only thing that helped these poor families. And then this little boy breaks my heart. Look how incredibly dirty he is and grabbing on to this little rag doll. And this other little tenant farmer child. And finally, as far as social reform, I thought I would introduce you to Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks, if you can believe it, was the youngest of 15, and he was from Kansas. He didn't even finish high school, and he taught himself photography. He was not trained or anything. And he actually wound up getting a Farm Security Administration grant to go document Washington, D.C. in 1942. Now, I found this quite fascinating because I don't know about you, but we often think of segregation as being in the South. And so somehow we don't think of D.C. It turns out that D.C., our nation's capital, was fully segregated in 1942. Look at this gorgeous photograph. I mean, it's terribly sad, but the way, he's got such a way of executing this from behind. This is a little boy that had lost his leg in an accident. And it's almost as if he's looking out at how other kids play on the street of Washington, and he's obviously not so able to do that. And the way, the composition is created with the door open and the child standing there is just absolutely phenomenal. Gordon Parks got to know this woman, Ella Watson. It turned out not only was she a cleaning lady of government offices, but she was also a grandmother. And he spent a great deal of time with her, seeing how she and her grandchildren lived. And so Gordon Parks is one of the most important photographers that documented not only segregation, but also the plight of the African-American community, the overcrowding. I mean, this photo in some ways is gorgeous, it's adorable, but it's also terribly sad. I mean, look at all these kids are like overflowing from this door. So it just shows you the kind of crowding and conditions. And this one makes me almost want to cry. It's these little three boys. One of them, if you see, he's kind of hidden in between. And it says 3 children waiting in the kitchen while their mother prepares the evening meal. And it's beautifully and terribly sad. I thought I would close Gordon Parks with this wild photograph. I didn't know this existed. Do you know that there was something called the doll test? For many years, it was used to see if little children had a bias, a racial bias in terms of what's better. Is it better to be white or is it better to be black? And he's captured this little boy in Harlem pointing to the white doll. Kids would be asked, what do you want to be or what's better? And a lot of the little African-American kids would immediately go to the white doll. And by the way, I learned that this test and results of this test were introduced to the famous court case of Brown versus Board of Education. It was a way of saying that segregation, if anything, was kind of highlighting this idea that, you don't deserve to be with the white kids. You're separate and different, and kind of using it as evidence that segregation is not about we're all equal in the, okay, that was kind of an awkward ending, but that's social reform. I just wanted you to keep in mind a huge part of, certainly of the early 20th century, you saw a lot of kids there being shown as part of the plight of improving conditions. Now I'm gonna transport you to France, and I want to acknowledge that there's so many other photographers. I did a little bit of curating and decided, let me show you a glimpse of what these guys did. We're going to start with one of the most important photographers of the 20th century is Henri Cartier-Bresson. Why is he so famous? He's almost considered the father of street photography. Right here is one of the big reasons. For years, people had tripods and huge cameras that required all kinds of equipment. He was one of the first artists to use a Leica which was a very small transportable camera that allowed him to run around and not stage things and not use a studio and capture what he eventually called the decisive moment. And he wrote a whole book. So if you ever Google Cartier-Bresson, he's almost like the man that invented the idea of a decisive moment. What is a decisive moment? It's the idea that if you run around the streets and you look and you have this small camera that can capture something in a second, you're going to be able to get these wonderful moments that you could miss in a second, right? And let me show you what he means by that. This is a print that comes up at auction a lot. By the way, I want to take you back to the 30s in France. And I want you to remember that that was the time of surrealism. And Henri Cartier-Bresson was very interested in creating images and prints that in many ways are completely surreal. So first of all, you have children, but you have them in a place that looks completely unchildlike. This is not a playground. This is actually like a broken down, destroyed construction here. And what he means by the decisive moment is taking a photograph in precisely the moment that, for instance, this child is here. It's almost the idea that, you know, this small portable camera lets me take this in that decisive moment. And he creates this image that is very surreal because you have this hole in the wall that's almost a window into the world of these children. And it's just something unlike anything you would normally see. By the way, if you're wondering, a lot of people think this must be the Spanish Civil War. It's actually 3 years before that. So it just so happens that it is in Spain, and it has that look of terror and war, but it's actually before then. Let me give you another example. He went to Madrid here, one of my recent homes. This is a decisive moment. You see, the boys are playing soccer, of course, a very big game in Spain. And it's this ability with this portable camera of just hang around, and I'm gonna get the shot in that decisive moment when the ball is about to go in the goal. But again, if you think of surrealism, he's captured these strange little geometrical windows of this building, and this boy, these big heads of these boys kind of looking at us. And there's just something very, very strange, right, about this moment. Now, later on, if you think about France after the war, I would argue that a lot of photography became much more lyrical and happy, and a way of almost embracing the culture and the heritage and the beauty of France. So those of you that have been to Paris might know this Rue Mouffetard is a very commercial street with lots of markets. And here this little boy carrying 2 magnum-sized wine bottles. And this is an adorable picture that's often at auction. And he looks so proud of doing his job. And again, watch how he focuses on the boy. And you know, the background is kind of blurred, but you're focused on this boy, and the vantage point is a little bit from above. And another artist, Willy Ronis, you know, one had wine. What's the other big thing in France? There's wine, there's cheese, and of course there's the baguette. So I find this image is adorable, and I actually own a copy of it. I see it whenever I go in and out of my bedroom. It makes me very happy. I just think it's kind of like the ideal picture of the little boy running freely with his baguette. And then I thought I would show you this one. You may recognize the name of this artist from that famous photograph he took of 2 people kissing by the Hôtel de Ville. But here again, it's almost this idea of Paris and France after the war, and the innocence of kids and the beauty of the culture. And what of course is wonderful is that this is literally a sign that's alerting you of student crossings. And of course the students are all there piling on and enjoying the sign. And then I thought I had to include this one because this is a beloved image by Alfred Eisenstadt. And what's amazing is he's managed to take the faces of these kids as they watch a puppet show of St. George and the Dragon. And apparently it's the moment that the dragon is finally slain. So they're all the way from ecstatic to freaking out, to worried, to excited, to everything else. And it's just an amazing, amazing image because we love images where instead of seeing what they're seeing, we're seeing their reaction. And it's just, and as we know, the French can dress their kids as no one else, and particularly imagine in the 60s. So the hats, the berets, the sweaters, everything is just so gorgeous. So let's cross the Atlantic. I better hurry up. We looked at France. Now let's look at this side of the Atlantic. Helen Levitt is probably the #1 most important photographer of children playing on New York streets. She was a lady of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. And guess what? She was a high school dropout. She was like, I don't care about this. I'm gonna work at a studio. And she became a street photographer. By the way, guess who she admired the most? She admired Henri Cartier-Bresson. She actually met him. And she admired Walker Evans. So the way I kind of curated this talk is I'm showing you people that admired those that came before. These are amazing photographs of children in New York. I want to remind you, this is pre-air conditioning, and this is pre-internet, and it's pre-television. So imagine, where were kids when you had no TV, no internet, and no AC? They were on the streets. And she went crazy and loved taking photographs of kids, particularly in Harlem and the Lower East Side. And if you think about it, there's a little bit of the decisive moment thing here as well, because this is not staged, and she waited for this moment when this little kid's picking something up, and this one's right there, kind of through the frame of this mirror. One of the things you'll notice about Helen Levitt's photographs, the composition is perfect. Again, this is almost like a decisive moment. It's that capturing that moment when these two little kids are dancing. It's worth noting that there's a lot of interracial integration happening in these photographs. It's actually quite beautiful to watch. There's little white kids and Hispanic and Black, and it's almost as if it really didn't matter back then whatsoever, as it should be. This one's an amazing, iconic photograph because she captured these 3 little kids at that exciting moment when they're about to go out at Halloween. And I love it because this one is already ready with mask on and like already ahead of the others. Then this one is like kind of in the process of almost being ready. And this one is a little bit behind, first putting her mask on. And then I threw this one in. I think it's so beautiful. Again, you've got this kind of very integrated group of little girls. And there's something magical because you've got the girls walking by as they see these little soap bubbles. And someone commented that, I mean, the way they're looking at the bubbles is very precious. And the bubbles in some ways are freer than they are. These are kids that to a great extent can't really leave where they live. And then finally, for Helen Levitt, another iconic photograph, it shows you how dangerous some of these street games could get. I mean, these little boys have basically climbed up on the pediment of a building. This is definitely not safe by 2020 standards, right? And then this little boy is looking at her as she takes the photograph. It's a beautiful, beautiful image. Oh my, I'm worried about time. Let's see. Robert Frank was a young Swiss, a young Jewish Swiss photographer that arrived in the US. And he actually was given a Guggenheim Fellowship. He wanted to explore the life of ordinary Americans throughout the US. And guess part of the reason he got that idea is he became friendly with Kerouac, who, as you know, wrote On the Road. So the idea of the road trips, of going out and getting to know the US, he was, I'm gonna document American life. And one of the reasons he's famous in the world of photography is because his photographs were specifically gonna be for a book. And many people argue that his book, called The Americans, was the first official photography book. And a lot of photographers after that became used to, we're not just taking individual photos here and there, we're making them into a book, a compilation. And so his book, The Americans, published in the late 50s, is kind of iconic for that. Now, here's the issue with Robert Frank. Imagine he went out and took, apparently it is said he took up to about 27,000 photographs of Americans. But then he just chose 83 photographs to include in his book. And while some of them, like this one, are basically, you could argue the America that Life magazine would like you to see. There's the big, beautiful flag and two little girls underneath it on July 4th. He also found some things in the US that were very troubling. So in the photographs he chose for this book, he included a photograph like this one, and it's actually the cover of the book. Imagine the book is by a Swiss Jewish immigrant, and the book's called The Americans, and this is the cover. Was not received very well. It was actually first published in France and only in the US a year later. He was shocked by some of what he saw across the US. For instance, the idea that I can entrust my baby to this woman, but she cannot sit next to me at a diner counter, was something that was just kind of like, what in the world is going on here? And mind you that the US in the 50s was considered, the place with the highest standard of living, the middle class, supermarkets filled with brands and goods and things that frankly in Europe you couldn't find. But he found this shocking. So this is a little bit of a segue now to what I would almost call some post-50s street photographers of New York in particular. He, in a way, laid the groundwork for saying, you know what, our photography doesn't have to be Life magazine. It doesn't have to be prim and proper and showing the best. And in an exhibition in 1967 called New Documents at MoMA, these three photographers on the left were featured precisely because their documentary photography was showing you stuff that maybe wasn't quite as pleasant. And some of you know Diane Arbus, and I'll show you a bit of Gary Winogrand and Lee Friedlander. By the way, in that MoMA exhibition, Diane Arbus famously stole the exhibition because her stuff was even further out there. But this is a great example. Now we're looking at Arbus looking at kids. And this is not what you would want to see in Life magazine. It's a kid basically aiming a gun at us. Her famous portrayal of these twins, it's one of Arbus's most iconic photographs. Some say it probably inspired Stanley Kubrick to have his twins in The Shining. I thought you'd have fun looking at the twins 30 years later. And this is another example of what Arbus did. She chose prints you know, she took tons of photographs of these people, and then she would choose one that was particularly troubling or uncanny. So this photograph, Child with a Toy Hand Grenade, is not only troubling because the child is making a weird face and has a hand grenade, he's also extremely skinny. It's a very uncanny, disquieting photograph. But here's what's funny. If you look at the series of photographs she took, this kid wasn't nearly as creepy as she made him look. Here he's like happy and drinking from a water fountain in Central Park. He looks like a cute, nice kid, but Arbus was known for giving us this. Gary Winogrand started out taking photographs of his own son, Ethan. Here's this really adorable picture of Ethan running towards us. I love these because Winogrand is, if you look at Winogrand photography, it's like an amazing time capsule of the 60s and the 70s. And here's these two little girls playing patty cakes. And only in New York, right, do you see this woman expecting and they're hailing a cab, 1968 New York. He would also look for stuff that was a bit strange, like Arbus. This is a photograph that was extremely controversial, strange. Imagine that just around the time of the civil rights movement, you have an interracial couple walking around the Central Park Zoo. And I know this lecture is about kids. Well, to them, they were carrying these little chimpanzees. So talk about kind of being a little bit on the edge, because back then this would have been like kind of outrageous. I mean, just the fact that they're interracial, but then they're carrying these chimpanzees, is, you know, it's really kind of a strange, unique photograph of the times. And just to give you another idea of what he would do, I mean, here he is at a state fair in Fort Worth. And I don't know if you can tell, but I mean, this boy looks practically just like this animal next to him. It's like, it's kind of humorous and it's kind of weird. Lee Friedlander, I love this. I thought I would throw it in because how often do we see this now in the 21st century? I think parents are so careful about their kids. This is like, let's basically bathe my son in the sink in the kitchen with the dirty dishes. Well, they're not dirty, mind you, they're already clean, but still. And Friedlander, if you know his photography, he's famous for these fabulous pictures that are often of people in front of store reflections and store windows. And so he really loves fooling your eye. If you notice, you might say, well, why is this in a kid's, you know, this is about kids. Well, guess what? There's a little girl here. It's actually a mom with her little girl looking into a store. And then I guess behind them might be a statue. So he's very famous for these images that really fool our eyes, and in particular use a lot of mirrors and reflections of stores. Bruce Davidson, quickly. Bruce Davidson did a lot of interesting series. He did one in the South during the civil rights marches. He did one of a Brooklyn gang he joined, and I'm going to include that in 2 weeks when we look at kind of the rebels and outcasts. This was a series he did. I love that it's in the year I was born. It was 1966, and apparently East 100th Street in Spanish Harlem was considered just about the worst street in New York. And he thought, I'm going to spend time with the people that live there, and I'm going to see what their life is about. This one really is terrifying. You've got these little kids peering out of this window, and I mean, the amount of garbage. This one makes you really think this really is frightful, but then you start seeing all these photographs that are very sweet and very wonderful. You've got this man holding this little girl also on East 100th Street. And then look at this. I mean, I love this because these little kids are all at a birthday party. I don't know, someone must have not showed up. Maybe the cake didn't come out. They don't look very happy. And yet the whole place looks adorable. They've got their balloons and their hats, and they're clearly celebrating a birthday. And then I love this because these girls, you know, as tough as that neighborhood might have been, they're like in their Sunday best, probably ready to go to church on a Sunday, I'm guessing, or maybe a special celebration. And so it's just a really beautiful image of all the things you can see just in one block of Manhattan. So now I love this little boy. I call this Looking South. Bear with me. First, before going to the American South, I thought we would go south of the border. I just want to acknowledge Manuel Alvarez Bravo, you know, since the 30s, and he was also considered a surrealist photographer. This is the kind of thing he was doing. This is a little girl in Mexico holding what we love to get on the Day of the Dead. It's una calaverita de azúcar. It's a little skull made out of sugar. Very often they have your name or various names. My name, Efren, was almost never available. And this beautiful image of this girl daydreaming, he calls it. And she's in probably what we call vecindad, which are these little communities where people live out alongside a kind of a central atrium or patio. And it's just a beautiful image. And then his wife, Lola Alvarez Bravo, this is much later. I love this image that she captured of these boys. She's obviously underneath these, oh God, the word's escaping me. They're obviously at a game, and they even have some mitts and equipment, but she made them be able to look underneath the seats. So now let's go quickly to the American South. This man, Ralph Eugene Meatyard, is considered a major, major photographer. His stuff is very strange and unquieting. I'm warning you, he was an optician. And let me just look here really quickly. We're talking about Lexington, Kentucky. He was an optician, and he started taking photographs of his own children. But the trick is, by the way, this is no longer street photography. Now this is very much staged. It almost takes us back to Julia Margaret Cameron. I'm using my kids, and I'm gonna stage these photographs. And he's known for using places like abandoned buildings, shadows, and things that look very, very creepy. So in a way, it's a gorgeous image, but there's also something slightly creepy about the fact that we can't quite see this child, and he's in the frame of maybe some farm. And let me show you why I'm talking creepy. There's garbage and papers, and this little boy, Meatyard likes to introduce dolls, and he introduces masks. And so when you think of Meatyard images, it's almost as if not only are you looking at children, but he considers dolls almost another type of human presence that's come into play. And so you've got the flag and the little boy looking kind of despondent, and this doll. There's something uncanny and creepy about these. And again, this boy, look how he captures half of his face is in shadows. It just looks dirty, it looks empty, it looks abandoned, and it looks kind of creepy. Like I wouldn't want my child in this scene. And it gets even creepier. Dolls and masks. Look at this little boy, but he's wearing this really nasty mask that'll give you nightmares. And again, this is all for kind of like artistic purposes. He's highly regarded, but I wanted to just show you something that's very, very different and very, very creepy. He's considered, let's see. He talks about masks as a way of universalizing his sitters, so that the boy is no longer that boy, it's just some boy. It's almost as if these kids are no longer my kids, and now they're props, they're standing in for something else. And he says the dolls represent a human physical presence. And I mean, these will give you nightmares. They're really, I'm only showing you a little bit, but they're really, really creepy. Very far away from street photography, original and disturbing. Very quickly, oh my God, I'm running out of time. William Eggleston, I thought I would show you because if you don't remember anything else about William Eggleston, he was the first photographer to ever have a color photography exhibition at MoMA. Color photography when we were kids, like when I was a kid in the early 70s, that's what you took Kodak camera photos with. It was not high art. The artistic photography was all black and white. William Eggleston changed that. He was taking what was considered these really banal, kind of like, who the hell cares? It's just a supermarket boy with carts. Imagine this photograph at MoMA in 1976. The curator thought it was just amazing, amazing, complex and beautiful. The complexity and beauty of the mundane world. And some of the critics at the New York Times said, perfectly boring, perfectly banal. One of them said, dismal figures inhabiting a commonplace world of little visual interest. But you see, he basically used a process called dye transfer prints that had only been used in advertising to that point. So he achieved color prints that were unlike anything that had ever been created, that were museum quality. So again, it's this stuff that's, you know, just kids and tricycles, but he achieved notoriety, and today he's considered almost like the man that legitimized color photography in the art world. The last two artists, Sally Mann, we're still in the South. We're talking about rural Virginia, and this is already very contemporary. Sally Mann is known for, in particular, her book that she issued called Immediate Family. In 1992, she published a book. As you remember, Robert Frank started this whole thing of books of photography, and hers was her kids. Her kids, Emmett, Jesse, and Virginia. So the reception of this was not only great acclaim, but it was also great discomfort. And you can start seeing why. Because in her mind, these are my kids, we live in rural Virginia, and they're beautiful dressed or naked. So some of the photographs are like this. They're really gorgeous, beautiful photographs of, you know, one of her children, nap time, and her hair. And I want you to think about Julia Margaret Cameron, because talk about this taking us back to, you know, my child can be this little angel with her hair and napping, and it's very, very allegorical and very lyrical. But of course, there were these, and these are the ones, but by the way, only 13 of the 70 or so images have nudity, but of course the Christian right went nuts. They were like, this is child pornography, this is outrageous. So this is Jessie at 5, you know, kind of looking sexy as a 5-year-old if you can. This is, I think this is Virginia with a little candy cigarette. This is Virginia at 5. So again, what I want you to keep in mind about Sally Mann is that she's a contemporary photographer known for these gorgeous black and white prints of her immediate family. And yet it's created a lot of controversy because, again, some thought, how dare you show your children naked? By the way, there's an interesting interview with Sally Mann and her grown daughter. And her daughter, I thought this was interesting, her daughter, because, you know, people were like, oh my God, what are your daughters gonna say when they're 21? And the daughter says, you know what, I'm just glad my mom was at home working with us. It was a wonderful thing that we had a mom that was doing photography and including us. And here, I think this is a beautiful comparison. I'm showing you Virginia at 5. And this is one of the girls in the photograph I showed you at the beginning by Julia Margaret Cameron. Imagine 1865, 1988. They're really not that different. Maybe it's context, maybe it's the times. And I'm gonna close with Loretta Lux, last few slides. Loretta Lux is a very young, I'm saying very young because she was actually born after me in 69, so I think she's extremely young. She's an artist from Germany, and that is actually her self-portrait, and it's in keeping with what her photographs are about. She's one of the most important contemporary photographers of children. Now you're gonna see these images and there's something really odd about them. I want you to notice the kind of the pastel backdrops, the fact that, I don't know, it almost is as if you're looking at something that's been highly manipulated. It doesn't look like I could get this photograph if I took a photo of this child. Well, this is the thing. She was actually trained as a painter. So these photographs involve photography, they involve painting, and they involve digital manipulation. And if you think about it, there's something very surreal about them. This drum, I mean, do we really believe this little boy's playing the drum? Do we really believe this ball is like kind of floating in front of this girl? She controls everything. She controls the colors of the costumes. If you can see, she's clearly chosen, this child has blue eyes, the little sweater's blue, the sky's blue. She's probably painted this entire background. She's a painter. And then she takes the child, she manipulates the size of the head is probably bigger than originally. And she places the digital image on the painted background. So I want you to think there's a lot going on here. The ultimate result, here's this girl, her little dress, the green and the pink match the green and the pink flowers. And so it does create this dreamlike, surreal, kind of haunting environment. The kids are also like strangely detached. This is just one more example. Look at where Pollen is sitting. I mean, it looks like this endless, endless beach or endless desert. And again, there's a little bit of the eyes matching the blues and the dress. And this kind of, it's this idea of painting, almost mimicking old Dutch portraits. Then very uncanny pastel, the contrasts are not very strong. If you think about it, it's all kind of slightly hazy. And I'm gonna close, which I thought would be a fun comparison, because Loretta Lux has worked with twins. So here you've got Sasha and Ruby in 2008. And I thought it would be fun to show them next to the identical twins that Arbus showed us back in the 60s. And I'm sorry, I'm a minute or two late. Let me stop sharing my screen. And by the way, this is just a reminder, in 2 weeks, again, photography on the fringe, rebels, outcasts, and subcultures. We'll look at Mapplethorpe. we're gonna look at we're gonna look at Danny Lyons, who followed a group of bikers around the US. So we're gonna look at a lot of rebels and outcasts and very interesting things. Okay, so now I'm gonna try to unmute everyone. You might have to unmute yourself. If you have a comment or question, please welcome now.
No, and just thank you, because really through the talks, you at least helped me appreciate some of the pictures that I might have looked at them and gone, ooh, this is too creepy. I'm just gonna go to the next one, no? And with your help, you know, you look at it differently and you appreciate them. And it's really
good.
great. Thank you.
I'm so glad, Rosa.
Gracias.
Efren, hi.
Hi.
I noticed that some of the modern photographers, they have a lot more things happening like around the edges, you know, like that girl that was napping. I don't know if you noticed, but there's like a naked torso in the background. And even though the girl is the African-American photographer, you know, the one with the grandmother and the kids, there was a reflection in the mirror, and there were like so many other things happening in the background.